Mark Caldwell gritted his teeth as he pressed a gauze pad against the gash on his forearm. The knife had slipped during food prep, slicing deep enough to make his stomach turn at the sight of exposed tissue. Blood trickled down his arm, dripping rhythmically onto the sterile metal floor of the alien medical bay. Across from him, Valen, the ship's designated medical officer, stood frozen, his bioluminescent skin shifting to an alarming shade of deep indigo. His wide, lidless eyes remained fixed on the wound. "You require immediate cellular regeneration," Valen finally managed, his voice edged with something bordering on panic. "I will prepare the dermal fusor." Mark shook his head. "No need, it's not that deep." He pulled open a first aid kit from his pack, retrieving a small bottle of antiseptic. As soon as he poured it over the wound, Valen recoiled, his elongated fingers trembling. "You are introducing foreign chemicals directly into your exposed flesh? That is madness." "It's disinfectant," Mark muttered, wincing as the sting shot up his arm. "Prevents infection." Valen looked unconvinced, but Mark was already moving on. He grabbed a pack of butterfly strips, peeling them open with his good hand. "What are those?" Valen asked, his voice unsteady. "Holding the wound closed," Mark explained, carefully applying the strips along the gash to pull the edges together. "These work fine for something like this." Valen's skin pulsed a sickly shade of gray. "You are using adhesive to force your own flesh to mend? Your species has functioning medical technology aboard this vessel, and yet you patch yourselves together like primitive beasts?" Mark sighed. "Valen, it's really not that bad." The alien took a slow step back, his gaze flicking between Mark's face and the crude repair job. "You must allow me to use the dermal fusor, or at the very least, the cellular stimulator." "Not necessary," Mark said, testing the movement of his fingers. "It's holding fine. I'll bandage it, and it'll heal on its own." Valen inhaled sharply, his chest expanding in a way that suggested barely contained horror. "It will heal on its own?" "That's how bodies work," Mark said, wrapping a clean bandage securely around his arm. Valen remained motionless for several seconds before exhaling in a slow, deliberate manner. "You humans, you truly do this to yourselves." "Yeah," Mark replied, adjusting the bandage. "It's just first aid." Valen's skin shifted to a muted blue, his posture stiff. "I must inform the captain of this." Mark groaned. "Please, don't—" But Valen was already moving toward the ship's intercom, his long fingers tapping rapidly against the panel. Within moments, the captain's voice crackled through the speaker. "What is it, Valen?" "Mark has sustained an injury," Valen announced, his tone grave. There was a brief pause. "Is he in medical?" "Yes, but he refuses proper treatment." "What?" The captain's voice sharpened. "Explain." "He has adhered his own flesh together with primitive strips of material and claims it will heal on its own." Another long silence. Then, "I'm coming down." Mark sighed, leaning back against the exam table. "Great." Minutes later, the doors hissed open, revealing Captain Ormek, a towering figure draped in the same sleek uniform as Valen, his four eyes locked onto Mark, then flicked to the bloodied gauze and discarded butterfly strip packaging. "What is this?" "First aid," Mark said wearily. Ormek stepped closer, examining the bandage like it was some relic of an ancient, barbaric civilization. "You refused medical treatment?" "I treated it myself," Mark clarified. Ormek turned to Valen. "Is this normal for their kind?" Valen's expression remained one of deep unease. "Apparently, yes." Ormek exhaled. "Humans are more concerning by the day." He returned his gaze to Mark. "You are certain this will heal without complication?" "As long as I keep it clean and change the bandages, yeah." Ormek studied him for a long moment before shaking his head. "You are an anomaly of a species." Mark chuckled. "Yeah, I've heard that before." Valen still looked unsettled, but Ormek sighed and gestured toward the door. "Very well, but if your wound worsens, you will report immediately." "Of course," Mark agreed, pushing off the table. "See? No big deal." Valen muttered something incomprehensible under his breath as Mark exited the medical bay. The moment the doors slid shut behind him, he could hear Ormac speaking again. "We need to reassess our understanding of human durability." Mark smirked. If only they knew how much worse it could get. A full day had passed since Mark's impromptu medical demonstration, and the crew had yet to recover from the shock. He could feel their stares in the corridors, their hushed exchanges whenever he walked by. Even the ship's environmental systems engineer, usually indifferent to anything outside his realm of expertise, had looked at Mark's arm with something bordering on morbid fascination. The bandage was holding up well. No signs of infection, no excessive swelling, just the dull ache that lingered with any deep cut. He was in the middle of checking it, peeling back the gauze, inspecting the healing edges, when the door to his quarters slid open. Ormac stepped in without preamble. He barely glanced at Mark's arm before speaking. "You are required in the medical bay." Mark sighed. "Again?" Ormac didn't elaborate, just motioned for him to follow. Whatever this was, it wasn't a request. The walk to medical was silent, save for the hum of the ship's artificial gravity systems. When they arrived, Valen was already waiting, standing beside an examination table that had been prepared with an array of medical instruments. Some of them Mark recognized, sterile wipes, dermal scanners, but others looked more suited for a high-tech laboratory than a simple wound check. Mark folded his arms. "Is this an intervention?" Valen gestured toward the table. "Sit." Mark hesitated before complying. The last thing he wanted was another round of concerned alien scrutiny, but resistance would only drag this out longer. Ormac remained standing near the door, his arms clasped behind his back. "We have reviewed your species' medical history. Your methods are inconsistent." Mark arched a brow. "Inconsistent?" Valen's expression was unreadable, but his skin had settled into a neutral hue. "Some human cultures utilize advanced regenerative technology. Others, however, rely on what can only be described as rudimentary trauma management." Mark shrugged. "Depends on where you are and what resources you have." Ormac's gaze flicked to Valen, who retrieved a small projection device and activated it. A holographic display flickered to life above the table. It showed various human medical procedures, some performed in sterile hospital environments, others in conditions that made Mark grimace. Field medicine, makeshift surgical repairs, battlefield amputations. Valen pointed at the display. "This is what concerns us." Mark exhaled. "Okay, yeah, some of that looks bad, but humans adapt. We do what we have to." Ormac gestured toward one of the more unsettling clips, an old video of a soldier sewing up his own gash with a curved needle and thread. Explain this." Mark leaned forward. "That's suturing. When stitches are needed and there's no medical facility nearby, you do it yourself." Valen's skin darkened slightly. "You pierce your own flesh repeatedly to force it to close?" "It's not as bad as it looks." Ormac's expression remained unreadable. "And this?" He pointed to another clip, showing a man using superglue to seal a wound. Mark nodded. "That's a field trick. Medical glue exists, but if you're in a bad situation, regular adhesive works in a pinch." Valen's fingers twitched. "You use industrial bonding agents on living tissue?" Mark shrugged. "It holds." The silence stretched between them. Ormac finally spoke. "Your species is unsettling." Valen retrieved a small scanning device and ran it over Mark's arm. "Your wound is healing as you predicted. However, we remain unconvinced that such methods are sustainable." Mark smirked. "We've been doing this for centuries." Ormac shifted his stance. "Which is precisely why we wish to understand it more thoroughly." Valen set the scanner aside and picked up a small, curved instrument. "We will simulate a minor laceration on a non-living organic sample. You will demonstrate your techniques." Mark blinked. "You want me to stitch something?" Ormac nodded. Mark exhaled. "Fine, but I'm not stabbing myself just to prove a point." Valen retrieved a strip of synthetic flesh, placing it on the table. "This will suffice." Mark rolled his shoulders, grabbed the provided suture kit, and got to work. He threaded the needle with practiced ease, then made the first stitch, pulling the synthetic material together. When he tied off the knot, he glanced up. Valen's skin had shifted to a pale hue. Ormek's posture stiffened slightly. Mark continued, demonstrating different techniques. Simple interrupted sutures, running stitches, mattress stitches. With each pass of the needle, the aliens watched in rapt, horrified fascination. When he finished, he set the needle down. Satisfied? Valen hesitated before nodding. This is effective, but it remains crude. Ormek studied the sutures. And this is common practice? Mark nodded. When necessary. Valen exhaled slowly. You humans endure far more than we anticipated. Ormek's gaze lingered on the stitched-up sample. We will need time to process this. Mark chuckled. Take all the time you need. As he stood to leave, Valen muttered something under his breath. Mark didn't catch it, but he had a feeling it was something along the lines of, humans are terrifying. 2 days had passed since Mark's field medicine lesson, and the ship's crew had yet to fully recover. Conversations hushed whenever he entered a room. Crew members who had previously been perfectly comfortable around him now observed him with a wary curiosity, as if expecting him to suddenly staple his own wounds shut for entertainment. Mark had spent most of the morning in the cargo bay, securing supply crates, when the intercom crackled to life. Mark, report to medical immediately. It was Valen's voice, and it carried an urgency that made Mark pause. He dusted off his hands and made his way to the lift, arriving at the medical bay within minutes. As the doors hissed open, he saw Valen and Ormek standing over one of the examination tables, where a younger crew member lay clutching his midsection. Mark stepped forward, taking in the scene. The injured crew member, a junior engineer named Relique, had a deep gash running along his side. The wound was still seeping, and the skin around it had already begun to discolor. Mark frowned. What happened? Ormek's posture was tense. Equipment malfunction. A pressure valve failed while he was performing maintenance. Valen gestured toward the medical instruments laid out beside Relic. We attempted standard regeneration, but his tissue is resisting fusion. His species has a unique cellular composition that complicates dermal repair under certain conditions. Mark's eyes flicked to the wound. It was deep enough to warrant immediate closure, and, if their usual methods weren't working, you want me to stitch him up? Valen hesitated before giving a slow nod. You demonstrated proficiency. Mark rolled up his sleeves. All right, I'll need a sterile field, sutures, antiseptic, and gloves. Valen moved quickly, retrieving the requested materials. Ormek, meanwhile, watched with arms crossed as Mark snapped on a pair of gloves and inspected the wound more closely. Relic, I need you to breathe steady for me, all right? The young engineer nodded weakly, his skin pallid. Mark grabbed a disinfectant wipe and carefully cleaned around the wound. Valen observed in stiff silence, but didn't interrupt. Once the area was prepped, Mark reached for the sutures. He threaded the needle with practiced ease, then looked at Relique. This is going to sting a little, but I need you to stay as still as possible. Relique swallowed, but gave a weak nod. Mark made the first stitch, his hands steady. The needle pierced flesh, and Relic tensed, exhaling sharply. Ormek shifted, but Mark remained focused. He pulled the suture tight, knotting it securely before moving to the next. Valen watched each movement with a rigid intensity, his fingers twitching slightly. By the fourth stitch, Relic's breathing had steadied. The process wasn't fast, but it was effective. Mark continued, closing the wound methodically. When he reached the final knot, he carefully clipped the excess thread and inspected his work. That should hold, he said, reaching for the bandages. He applied a layer of dressing over the sutures, securing them in place. Keep this clean and don't do anything that'll put strain on it. I'll check it again in a day or two. Valen exhaled, his skin cycling through a series of subdued hues. This method is unsettlingly effective. Ormek studied the sutures, his expression unreadable. And this will heal as expected? Mark peeled off his gloves. As long as there's no infection and he doesn't tear it open again, yeah. Relic gave a weak chuckle. That was Unpleasant. Mark grinned. Beats bleeding out. Valen ran a scanner over the wound, his fingers still slightly unsteady. This is not a method we would have considered. Ormek gave a slow nod. But it works. Mark cleaned up the instruments and stretched. You're lucky it was a clean cut. Jagged wounds are a pain to stitch. Valen blinked. There are? Worse injuries? Mark smirked. Oh, you have no idea. 3 days later, Mark was back in medical, not because of injury this time, but because Ormek and Valen had summoned him for what they called a controlled assessment of human resilience. He had a bad feeling about it. The medical bay had been rearranged. Instead of the usual sterile efficiency, a table now held various tools, some familiar, some decidedly alien. A synthetic flesh model lay in the center, similar to the one used before, but this time a mechanical arm was positioned above it, holding what looked suspiciously like a scalpel. Mark folded his arms. So? What exactly are we doing today? Ormek gestured toward the setup. We wish to understand the full scope of human emergency medical responses. Valen adjusted the controls on the mechanical arm. We will create simulated injuries and you will demonstrate your methods for addressing them. Mark exhaled. You've got a real fascination with human suffering, huh? Valen's skin darkened slightly. It is not fascination, it is preparation. Mark glanced at the mechanical arm. And I assume this thing is cutting into the synthetic tissue? Ormek nodded. At varying depths and severities. Mark rolled his shoulders. All right, let's do this. Valen activated the device. The scalpel made a clean incision across the synthetic flesh, about 5 centimeters long, shallow but enough to mimic a real wound. Mark inspected it. Butterfly strips will do fine for this one. He reached for the adhesive strips, carefully pulling the edges of the cut together before applying them. This is good for small lacerations, holds the skin in place while it heals. Valen observed closely. And if the wound is deeper? Ormek tapped a control and the arm made another incision, this one deeper and jagged. Mark nodded to himself. That's a stitching job. He retrieved the suture kit, threading the needle quickly. You want to use interrupted sutures for something like this. Makes it easier to manage tension across the wound. He worked efficiently, needle piercing the synthetic flesh in a steady rhythm. After tying off the final knot, he looked up. That should hold. Valen cycled through a series of colors before speaking. And if the bleeding is severe? Ormek activated another function. The synthetic model released a dark fluid, mimicking heavy blood loss. Mark grabbed gauze immediately, pressing down firmly. Direct pressure first. The fluid slowed, but didn't stop entirely. Mark reached for a hemostatic agent, sprinkling it over the wound before applying fresh gauze. This helps with clotting. Valen's fingers twitched. And if this fails? Mark secured a bandage tightly. Then we move to a tourniquet if it's a limb. But you only do that if it's absolutely necessary. Cuts off circulation. Ormek observed the setup. Humans manage severe trauma with such simplicity. Mark wiped his hands. We don't always have fancy tech to rely on. Valen hesitated before activating the next function. The synthetic model now had a puncture wound. Mark frowned. All right, this one needs a different approach. He grabbed a pack of chest seals. If something punctures deep enough, like a lung, you need to prevent air from getting in. He applied the seal firmly, pressing down to ensure an airtight bond. This keeps the lung from collapsing. Valen's skin pulsed a muted blue. You have encountered such injuries frequently? Mark exhaled. More often than I'd like. Ormek adjusted the settings again. The model now displayed a burn, the synthetic material warped and darkened. Mark reached for a cooling gel. First step is stopping the burning process. Running water is best, but in the field, this works. He applied the gel in a thin layer before covering it with a non-stick dressing. Never use regular fabric on burns. Sticks to the wound. Valen's posture stiffened. Your species retains extensive knowledge of injury management through first-hand experience? Mark nodded. Trial and error, mostly. Ormek deactivated the simulation. This has been illuminating. Valen examined the treated wounds. You navigate injury with unsettling efficiency. Mark stretched his shoulders. You'll get used to it. Ormek's expression remained unreadable. I am uncertain that we will. 2 weeks had passed since Mark's medical demonstrations, and the ship's crew had yet to fully come to terms with his approach to injury management. While they no longer looked at him like he was a reckless lunatic, there was still a layer of unease whenever medical discussions arose. Mark had just finished a routine systems check in the engineering bay when the emergency klaxons blared. His pulse jumped as the ship's automated alert system announced a critical failure in the lower maintenance deck. He bolted for the nearest lift, heart hammering. As soon as the doors opened, the scene before him sent his instincts into overdrive. 2 engineers were crouched over a crew member on the floor. Relic. His leg was pinned beneath a collapsed support beam, and a dark pool of blood was spreading beneath him. Mark dropped to his knees beside them. What happened? One of the engineers, a frantic-looking navigator named Fell, gestured at the beam. Structural compromise. It gave way while he was running diagnostics. Mark's eyes flicked to Relic's leg. The limb was twisted unnaturally beneath the weight of the beam, and the bleeding was too heavy to ignore. He pressed his fingers to Relic's neck. His pulse was weak and rapid. Get this beam off him. The 2 engineers scrambled to lift it. The moment the weight shifted, fresh blood surged from the wound. Mark ripped open his emergency pack, grabbing gauze and pressing it hard against the torn flesh. Relic groaned, his face contorted in pain. Mark's brain clicked into motion. The break was bad, compound fracture, judging by the unnatural angle, but the immediate concern was stopping the blood loss. He grabbed a roll of elastic bandage and wound it tightly above the injury. Fell's eyes widened in horror. You're cutting off circulation! Mark didn't look up. That's the point. He's bleeding out. The compression slowed the flow, but it wouldn't hold forever. Mark pulled out a clotting agent and poured it directly onto the wound before layering more gauze on top. Relic's breathing hitched. Ormek's voice crackled over the intercom. Medical team is en route. Mark cursed under his breath. He doesn't have time to wait. He grabbed 2 metal rods from a nearby toolkit, aligning them along Relic's leg. The fracture needed stabilization, not ideal, but it would do. He secured them with strips of fabric torn from his own sleeve. Relic's eyes fluttered. His skin was going pale. Mark leaned in. Stay with me, all right? You're not dying today. The lift doors hissed open, and Valen rushed in, medics in tow. His gaze locked onto the improvised splint, then the tourniquet. You restricted blood flow? He was bleeding too fast, Mark said. You need to set the fracture before transport or he'll go into shock. Valen hesitated for the briefest moment before nodding. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, injecting a stabilizing compound into Relic's bloodstream. The medics secured an oxygen mask over his face. Ormek's voice came through again. Status? Valen pressed a scanner to Relic's chest. He is stable enough for transport. The medics lifted Relic onto a stretcher, moving swiftly toward the lift. Valen lingered, his eyes flicking toward Mark's makeshift splint. This was effective. Mark exhaled, running a hand through his hair. It had to be. Valen's skin pulsed in a muted hue. You continue to unsettle us. Mark let out a breathless chuckle. Yeah, I get that a lot. Ormek stepped into the room, surveying the scene. His gaze lingered on the blood-stained floor. Relique will recover? Valen gave a slow nod. Thanks to human intervention. Ormek considered that for a long moment before speaking again. Perhaps we should reassess certain aspects of emergency medicine. Mark smirked. No, grinned. Took you long enough. Valen shook his head, but there was no denying the reluctant admiration in his expression. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, they didn't look horrified. Just impressed.